I get started in speaking with the panel, I want to remind everyone that you can use the Hoover app to post questions to our panelists, and we will get to that section of the Q&A towards the end of this particular session. So just to go back to some of the learnings we had in the summits last year. Now, Jacqueline and Evette both led workshops at those summits. And some of the things that we talked about was how the pervasive cultural stereotypes that we have been exposed to throughout our lives, through the messages we receive in TV, media, radio, some jokes that we may have heard amongst our family, our friends, our colleagues, you know, so all of those things are kind of embedded in us, and we've learned about those implicit bias and those unconscious biases that we hold. And when we think about those, as we work with individuals, you know, Jackie, I get to ask you, Jacqueline, I could ask you, why is it important for us to learn about unconscious bias in the work that we do? And why should we focus on unlearning those biases?
Thank you, Raysheema. Avivo, if you're not familiar, has services about 20,000 people a year. So it's a pretty large nonprofit with housing and chemical mental health, women's programs, and it has a school institute. So Avivo's been talking about this and trying to figure out ways for a few years where our staff is predominantly Caucasian women, and the people that we serve are, you know, brown people and people of color in the 70% at any given time. So really a need to understand, listen, and hear what's needed and what are we doing to allow, you know, the balance of people we serve with the people, what our staff looks like. And so we've implemented a few things. We are the epicenter of the beginning of some of this with George Floyd in Minneapolis. So to the fact that our building is still boarded up. We're literally 6 blocks from one of the riot centers. So our community has really felt it and is very, very active on a daily basis with equity and really talking about how do we all kind of unravel what we've learned and what we think we know and what we don't know and listen. So we've created what's called affinity groups, and we've had first of all defining from people of color what it feels like, what in educating all of us that are not in that, and so we can be kind of a one Avivo, and really, you know, having safe spaces to talk and talk about people's feelings, what they want to see more of. And Avivo's made a commitment to really identify that and regularly meet together, have listening sessions, create these affinity groups where, you know, recruiting and onboarding is specifically focused, that is going to be a mission of ours to balance things more effectively and, you know, kind of unravel why it got that way. Because if you don't know why you got that way, you're going to be that way again, likely. So those are some of the things we're doing. And I think really listening to our participants, but our staff and how they feel in environments where they might be one or two of many. So.
Thank you for, you know, explaining what, you know, Avivo is doing right now to kind of, you know, remedy what's going on over there in Minneapolis. And as you spoke of, you know, when we think about the folks that we serve, you know, we have to also think about the systemic bias and the systemic and as well as the implicit bias and how are they connected. And so, Victoria, I wanted to ask you, you know, when we think about unconscious bias, it can be easily identified, you know, when working with an individual. But how do we recognize bias within our organizations or the systems that we work within?
Well, thank you also, Raysheema, for inviting me to be here. I am here representing Episcopal Community Services, and our major focus is to really begin to look at and challenge intergenerational poverty and to also increase upward mobility for our participants. So, you know, when I think about, unconscious bias, it's something that we definitely have to be more aware of. It's something that we have to really begin to shine a light on. And I was thinking about the first question you asked about unlearning them. Actually, what I think is really important and that we're striving to do at Episcopal Community Services is to actually become aware of them and to identify them. And what we really want to do is begin to change behaviors, because, with the unconscious bias, yes, we get all of these. Unconscious bias is unintentional. Most times it's things that are unconscious. We've created these unconscious biases from all the stories in our experiences from growing up. So what I often talk about is, how can we change the behaviors? Because we've been having a lot of discussion about it. We can learn about it, but I think the next step is to really begin to change the behaviors. So when I think about, individuals, and you have individual, conversations, yes, you can see that through, people's reactions. You can see it through people's opinions about, particular things. However, but people make up organizations. So if you don't begin to deal with the individuals who eventually become people sitting in places of power, who are the program directors, who are developing the programs, who are creating the systems within a program, then that's how you get to the systemic unconscious bias that stays there. So, when you look at organizations, you can look at your power dynamics. You could begin to look at your policies and your procedures. Are your policies really designed for some people, or are they really designed for all people? So, and those are some things that, your employees really are aware of, and they begin to recognize. I talk a lot about culture, and I think also understanding your culture, the culture of one's organization is the place to start, because usually your culture is that systemic environment that you begin to create. So really, you have to really begin to go in and undo some of those issues in your environment. So, I think just looking at policies, procedures, and how do you really get things done? How do you make decisions? How do you not make decisions? Because that's also is a thing that actually happens as well. Promotions, who get promoted, who doesn't get promoted, who has a seat at the table and who does not. So those are just some brief things that really begin to help you to zoom in on what is your organization doing and how to begin to unravel the systemic process that you want to change. And it starts with the individuals.
Yeah, thank you for that, Victoria. And it makes, as you said, it's the individuals within the organization that makes up that culture, and people that can carry those biases and also really that shape that culture within the organization. And I know that Episcopal Community Services, Washington State, DCYF, as well as Franklin County has actively worked on diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts over the past several years. And so I wanted to put out the question to Joy, to Evette, as well as to you, Victoria. Can you each briefly share why your organization felt it was important to focus on this effort? And what prompted this intentional work on DEI within your organization?
So again, thank you so much. Currently right now, I serve as the director of Franklin County Job and Family Services. Basically, I am the director that oversees all the administration of public assistance benefits. I also work hand in hand with our commissioners to ensure that these programs that we fund are equitable. The reason why we did it was because we started doing a poverty blueprint plan because we had so many organizations doing great work, but the work was not aligned. We started with individuals who actually lived in poverty. And we began looking at the data, not that we didn't know it before, but when you look at the data, when you ask the why we did it, and you look at who's been impacted by poverty or any type of disproportionate issue or injustice, it always was Black and brown people as well as women. So then as we were sitting in these rooms with large system leaders, once we got back and doing this data search, the question was, okay, let's go back 10 years, let's go back 4 years, let's go back 30 years. And it is the same demographic of people. And we decided that we have to stop using the data as sound bites to get jarring effects when we're doing speeches. And we have to be intentional about who we fund, who's in the room, who's not in the room, and not just for the purpose of checking boxes, but really, to Victoria's point, of changing a culture. So we said we're going to call it racism because that's what it is. We're going to own it, and we're going to provide training through the Racial Equity Institute, as well as through Raise the Bar with Courtney Kerrigan, to large system leaders across several systems: business, government, human services, everyone. And it's not a training where you say, okay, I got a certificate, let me go back and, show that I have a certificate. We are now measuring, what are you doing with the dollars that you are being funded with from our organization, and who are you assisting? And are they really being impacted? And does your policies really, as again, to Victoria's point, are your policies inclusive? So that's why we started doing what we did. We looked at the data, and it was a part of our poverty blueprint plan, and it was something that we couldn't shy away from.
Yeah, and it sounds like you guys really wanted to create a streamline of accountability to all of those organizations that you're funding, to make sure that there was equitable practices happening as you work with these communities.
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Joy. Evette, can you talk a little bit about Washington DCYF's efforts?
Yes, thank you so much for having me on the panel. I'm like so pumped by everyone. This is great. Thank you. Yeah, so just a little bit about our agency, Washington Department of Children, Youth, and Families. We're a relatively new agency. We came together piece by piece starting in 2017. And my originating agency and how I came to work with EMPath is I was part of the former Department of Early Learning. But basically our agency is responsible for like statewide preschool. We also now have child welfare, CPS, and juvenile rehabilitation, our juvenile rehabilitation and parole system. So the goal of our agency is like, how do we prevent a lot of our children, youth, and families from entering some of these systems that we don't want them ending up in? Because the data is clear, just like Joy was saying, across the country, and we see it in Washington, disproportionately the kids who end up in our facilities are Black and Brown. The kids who end up being called in for child protective services are Black and Brown, and the kids who are disproportionately experiencing poverty are Black and Brown. And so we can't ignore that. If we're really about our mission as an agency is ensuring all children, youth, and families are thriving. And we know that, Black, Indigenous people of color are disproportionately impacted. And if we don't look at that in the face, we're not going to get anywhere. What we've been doing, all of our originating agencies have had many efforts around DEI. And specifically within, the Department of Early Learning, we really took on the goal of we know we're going to lead our all of our efforts around race. We know there's many intersections of how people face oppressions in the system, but we need to be very explicit and say, and kind of really get folks comfortable with talking about race and looking at it. Because even when we, I'll just say one thing that just happened the other day, we're building policy around how are we going to lead as an agency for racial equity and social justice. And that's what we're calling our DEI work, is racial equity and social justice work. And it's hard for folks to say words that activates you, because that's how we've been socialized, is to not look at it, to not say anything. And so our kind of theory of change in our approach is how are we normalizing these conversations? How are we kind of making it part of our day-to-day conversation so we're not ignoring it? But are also organizing some infrastructure around it. We have trainings, but we're also making sure that we have folks who are identified as leads within the agency who are creating action plans around what we're going to do to advance racial equity within each of our programs and divisions. And that's all kind of shaped around a shared framework, because, sometimes when we talk about equity, people have different ideas of we have words, we don't have some shared language. So that's a lot of our kind of foundation building.
Yeah. And I definitely want to get back to some of Washington's efforts and what you guys have truly done around equity and your partnership with the tribal communities. But I wanted to talk to Victoria, have her speak on Episcopal's efforts around implementing a DEI focus, because she and I had talked about this before, and Victoria will say, let's call it what it is. Joy has said to me, let's call it what it is. Yes. And so, Victoria, if you can share, how you all started with this effort, what kind of brought this up for ECS and where you are now.
Okay. Well, the way we came to this work, actually we are now celebrating 150 years of providing work in social service work, particularly here in Philadelphia. And there was a question that someone had asked in terms of, poverty. We have our programs, we've been doing this work, and there was a question that asked us, like, who have we really helped to take out of poverty? So that was a very intriguing question. We really didn't have the data to really answer that question, but we could definitely rely and go back to all the wonderful services that we've done. And at that time, we were actually in a transition. There was new leadership coming on board. Our new CEO came on board. He and I had several conversations. And one of the things that we recognized was that the workforce and the workplace globally really was beginning to change. And people sitting right next to you, early on in our parents' days, everybody was pretty much the same age, but now you have a wide diversity of people who are actually sitting in the same offices with you. So we knew that we really had to begin to figure out how to begin to change and look at workplace demographics, because I have this idea or thought that before we actually go abroad, you always have to take care of home. So we wanted to really look at ourselves internally and who are the people providing the services? Well, the services are provided by our staff, by the team. So we thought that it was great to focus in on who are the people providing the services. So our CEO he came up with this position. We're going to recreate a position to really say we want to focus on diversity and inclusion. And actually, a quick story, my position title was going to be diversity and inclusion. And I asked that, could we reverse it? I wanted it to be inclusion first, because diversity, as Joy said, we didn't want to just check off boxes. Every time I mention my position title, I want to remind myself it's about inclusion. It's about bringing people together. So we knew that it was time that we really had to start to really focus in on our staff, really think about what are the tools and the education that our staff needed so we can really begin to set up a process for really bringing this really more deeply into the organization. So we really started, and we still are in the phase of really looking at leadership, looking at our coaches, who are the people in the organization that really needs this training. So once again, you think about the unconscious bias from the individual standpoint. If we're the ones creating the programs, making the decisions, we've been talking about this population forever, via social workers, human service workers. We always think we know what it is they need, what it is they want, but we first have to check ourselves and check out our biases, because we take those biases to our programs. So we wanted to start there, and that's really how we really got intensely involved.
Yeah, and I know that you guys have, embarked on some initiatives and as well as put some processes in place in order to do this. And I would love for you and for Evette and Joy, Jackie, if you want to chime in as well, what are some of the initiatives that you have implemented, or processes that you have implemented that you can say that has been especially successful because of these DEI efforts?
So I think, if I'm just going to jump in just real quick. So first of all, with our poverty blueprint plan, Franklin County is made up of 1.3 million people. It is projected that we're going to grow by an additional 1 million people in the next 10 to 15 years. So that's why we put together that blueprint. But some of our efforts have been, since we're the largest funder in Franklin County, we are now asking, I believe, questions we didn't ask before. What does your boards look like? Who are you serving? Are they moving up the economic mobility ladder? Are they equitable? When we currently just, we're in the process of building a new jail and a morgue. I say morgue, they say you're supposed to say forensic science center because of CSI and all that, it's a morgue. So in that, in those contracts, we mandated that the people living in the communities, particularly those impacted by poverty, Black and brown people, should have an opportunity for those jobs. So we funded a program with intensive wraparound services so people can be successful. So now we've graduated about 80 people. Some of them have walked out. Many of them are all walking out with $40,000 to $60,000, $70,000 jobs, and they look like Black and brown people and women. The other thing we're doing is many times when we look at the juvenile justice system, you know, we talk about Black men making up 17% of the population, but 31% of the arrests. That's in Franklin County as well. So when we look at our juvenile justice court, you know, 73% of their families that they are interfacing with are Black boys. So what we did was, which we've never done in the history of county government, for those of us who are mandated to provide core services, we have intertwined or braided our services to target families going through that juvenile justice system, whether they're there for truancy or whether they're there through a rock in a window. If mom comes with son, we are now intervening saying, hey, we're here, we're doing an assessment. How can we stabilize your home if you need it? And who else lives in the home? In fact, we're coming to the home. Is there an uncle? Is there a cousin? We're going to make sure that we wrap around your home so that this young man, because we understand the environment impacts his trajectory. So we want to make sure we're being intentional. So, and again, we have the poverty blueprint plan where we're aligning all of our systems in order, because we believe that silo systems perpetuate racism. So there's several things that we're doing, and for the sake of time and for my fellow panelists to jump in, those are the few things that we're doing here in Franklin County.
Thank you, Joy.
Yeah.
Yvette, do you want to chime in? And I know you
Well,
guys
I wish we had.
extensive equity work.
No, I'm so excited about what Joy's saying, because you know, I was just thinking about like what we're most proud of, and I think we're like, because we are a state agency, you know, we're just kind of in the early stages, and I was going to say, like, the thing that I'm most proud of at this point, and for me, I can't even believe that we haven't done this. You know, I'm learning the juvenile rehabilitation system, and you know, and one of the things that we're doing is really engaging with our young folks. You know, we're in several planning processes this year. We're doing our agency-wide strategic plan, and I see my colleague Carrie on the phone. And you know, with our early learning plan, we're doing our Washington early learning plan. And really, like, I'm proud of like our process. Like, one of the things that we're really trying to be intentional in doing, you know, if we're about eliminating racial and ethnic disproportionalities and disparities, we really need to be partnering, we need to be shifting power to the folks who are most impacted. And so that's what we've been doing with our strategic planning process. Like, we've been like spending a lot of our time building relationships with our young folks who are in JR, who are predominantly Black and brown. In our state, like, actually white youth are arrested more than our young folks, but then that flips when you see who gets transferred into adult systems. So it's like 77% of the kids who are transferred into adult systems are Black and brown versus 23% of our white kids. So it's blatant. And so one of our goals is, as an agency, is how do we successfully transition our youth into other systems? How do we support our young folks? And so we're partnering directly with them to co-create those strategies. And I see that work happening as well with our mobility mentoring, partnering with tribes, partnering with our communities to kind of co-create what our strategies look like.
Yeah, thank you. Victoria, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I'm gonna chime in. I'm striving to figure out how to, condense it all down because it's so many different things. And I guess the one thing I will say that in my role, like, there's these two major buckets. So we have the diversity and inclusion, and then we also have our advocacy initiative, where we really are also focusing on elected officials. What are some of the policies that we really want to change? When you start to think about systemic issues, we know that, we can have all the good intentions in the world, but we really have to begin to impact the policies, build relationships with the policy makers. We begin to have the data, begin to be able to form relationships to show that these policies are not positive for Black and brown individuals. So there's a whole lot of work going on in regard to our advocacy area. But in terms of our diversity and inclusion, once again, really striving to focus in on internally our staff. We started out with just having some awareness sessions, awareness trainings, where we didn't want to just hit people, initially with, racism, but we did things around gender and gender identity. We took a look at, men and, what's our relationship to men as it relates to our organization. We started to really take a look at, what are some of the other things that are really highlighting how people really feel and what keeps getting in the way of the biases. So we did some stuff around frame of reference. We just started doing some work around unconscious bias specifically. So we wanted to really begin to take our team to just be aware of what's happening, to start to dialogue with each other. There never had been a lot of dialogue, and through the dialoguing, you really begin to figure out who's who, how do people really feel. And when we talk about diversity and inclusion, it's really tough to be able to bring diverse group of people who are of different ages, gender, race, and actually the diversity of thought to really begin to work as a team to figure out what is our goal going to be. We also did, what I'm really proud of is our dashboard. One of our staff members asked us, who are we? Do we really even know who we are? So we really wanted to take a look at it. We call it an inclusion dashboard, where we took a look at how many people who are here that are Black females or Black females, and the children. And we wanted to look at that as it related to our staff and to our board. And actually there was some really significant learnings because our staff and our participants lined up more, but actually our board demographics was very, very different. So our board is actually bearing witness to that and saying, wow, we really need to also begin to include and make our board even more diverse. But really taking a look at this dashboard about who's with us, where do people live, what is the age group, where are most of our participants who are in our programs living, to give us a base to really begin to start to figure out what our next steps will be. But it's been a lot of training and focus on how to educate and give our staff the tools that they need, so when they are engaging with our participants, that process looks a little different. And it's not just us telling our participants what they want, but we're actually meeting our participants where they are. So, those are just some of the small things that we have actually not small, but, really large things that we've actually begun to do. And we have a lot more that's in the channels to be started as well.
Thank you, ladies, for sharing that. And all that you guys are doing, and I mean, Joy talking about the blueprint, and you, Victoria, and your team kind of doing grassroots inside the organization, and Evette, you guys in Washington are really doing some great work around that equity space. But I'm quite sure that there were some challenges along the way. And I don't want to, we're talking about all the great things that has come out of this work, but, I think it's important for us to share some of those challenges that have come up for you guys along this process. And it'd be great if you can share some of those challenges and kind of what you've done to address those challenges.
So can I jump in really quick?
Absolutely.
When you call a thing, especially when you say, racism is racism, and no matter how many times you go back in history and look at the numbers, who's being impacted isn't changing, there's some people that will disagree with you, and they're going to publicly disagree with you. And they're going to make sure they are in the newspaper disagreeing with you. And I experienced that. But it wasn't my job to convince them of what history has already shown us and continues to show us. I had to make sure, as the leader of overseeing this project, the stakeholders that were involved, whether it was corporate or government or human services, that those leaders who were assisting them developing this blueprint, did they believe it? Because if they didn't, then they would stifle the process of us trying to bring in the community, as well as changing policies that will impact people. So some of the challenges have been, when you work for government, it's public. And there's a lot of people who just do not agree, no matter how many times you look at the data and history and flip the numbers, they will say that thing is not that thing, and I had to graciously disagree with them, and it was fun.
Thank you, Joy.
Well, Joy, as you were talking, I'm thinking, wow, yes, exactly. Some of the challenges, just calling a thing. When you start to talk about bias, unconscious bias, privilege, and particularly power, power is that word that, people just do not want to deal with. When you talk about privilege, you'll hear things like, well, I've earned where I am, and I've worked for this, and like, what are you talking about? And even I personally just felt sometimes like, if you refer back to John Lewis, he talked about, good trouble. I was like that sound bite, I was that amplified voice that was always reminding us of, what we're doing here, what it really is. This is not a blame game. This is really about our participants. And you have to bear witness, and you have to speak truth to power if you really want to, change some things. And just really bringing all the folks in the room. It sounds really nice. I used to say, unofficially, this all sounds cute, but it may sound cute, but the work is very, very hard. It's work that takes a lot of time. It's not something that's going to change overnight, that is instant, because what you're striving to do is change behaviors.
Right.
You can't necessarily change beliefs, but what I would always commission is we must change, our behaviors. And frankly, and it's a positive thing. I would tell my organization, when we experience conflict, when we experience pushback, that's when inclusion is really working. That's what's supposed to happen, because now we're really getting into the nitty gritty. And I use a model that I'm sure all of you are familiar with. It's the iceberg model. And you talk about, where the iceberg is and where that line is, and all the things above the line are the things you can see. That's your goals. That's your systems, your policies, and your procedures. But below that line are the attitudes, your values, your belief systems. And what's beneath that line is what can sink the ship. So, when we often think, we're on our way and we're sailing this ship and we run into a iceberg, well, it's that thing down the bottom. So I've always talked about, you got to dig deep. We got to bring that stuff from down the bottom to the top. So that is a challenge. It's a challenge in leadership, because when you start talking about power, it's just this unspoken thing that we all have. And it's about not power over, but power with. And how do you get an organization, institutions who it's usually been power over and not power with. So those have been, I can say some of the, general challenges is the pushback. Victoria, what are you talking about? And sometimes it's very lonely. I will say that sometimes it's very lonely, but I feel like if that's my role, I have to be that amplified voice to strive to help people to begin to really get it out and have this conversation.
Thank you, Victoria. I'm laughing and Joy's laughing because we had this conversation. She's like, listen, it's lonely. Sometimes you're going to be the only person, with that amplified voice, but, stay strong and, make sure that you understand the work that's ahead of you, and it's going to feel lonely, but I think together, for me, having this conversation during this session with all of you is truth to power, what we want to do within the exchange, and to continue to have these conversations. And so one of the things that I want to do now, I have so many more questions, and I know people want to ask questions of all of you. And so I'm going to ask Katie, do we have any questions for our panel?
Yes, we do. And everyone, this is a reminder, you can submit your questions through the Whova Q&A. And if for any reason, if you're having trouble with it, if you're able to access the Zoom chat, feel free to send them through there. I'll be monitoring both of them. So none of the questions were specifically for one of the panelists, so I guess everyone could take some time to answer each of them. And so we got one that says, what are the challenges to culture shift like this during telework?
Can you repeat that question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, not a problem. So it says, what are the challenges to culture shift like this during telework or virtual work?
If I can just, just from my perspective, because we're still putting together some of the pieces for the blueprint plan, it is galvanizing, because I think there's still some disconnection in trying to connect people virtually. And, I think sometimes, you lose the passion when you're not in the proximity with the person. So sometimes I feel like there are audiences that I'm sitting in where people are just kind of going through the motion because they've been in their 50th Zoom, and I need the best of them because I need them to make a real, actual, considerate decision for people's lives. But I think sometimes there's a disconnect in engagement when we're doing these virtual meetings, because people are bombarded. That's my Cliff Notes version of it.
Yeah.
If I can chime in here, one thing we're seeing too is like kind of that disconnect or going through the motion, or someone not having, the ability in our participants' case to, be online, or a consistency in their access. So really working towards making sure everybody has access for us to serve them correctly. And another thing, we've gone out in the field and said, let's stand 6 feet apart just to see your face, just to do some more personal engagement, because it's been a long time. It hasn't been a couple months, it's been 6, 7 months. So, that's how we're kind of working to keep engaged and see that the challenges, break down some of those challenges, and keep people hopeful. It's a hard time and nobody knows the end of it. So how do we as staff also keep ourselves up and keep ourselves interested and hopeful, and then project that on our participants? So that's a couple things that we've been doing.
Yeah, I agree with what was said. I do feel a little fortunate that we've had about a good 3 years to really dig in and do some intensive face-to-face work with our staff prior to the pandemic hitting. One of the things that we have done, immediately following George Floyd's murder, I actually hosted some informal listening sessions via Zoom. So we were still able to connect with one another, to be there with one another, to share when you wanted to share or did not want to share. So I like Joy, I really need to feel and to sense and to connect with people, on an individual basis. However, this is where we are now. So I just think just encouraging, keep doing what you're doing, but it definitely is hard not to have that one-on-one. A big part of our work also is interfacing with elected officials, and we're not able to do that. We were just starting to, be able to go up to Harrisburg and to be in the faces of the elected officials and talk about some of these policies that do not support the work or the work and the health of our participants. So that's been a little challenge as well. But so right now, our listening sessions is something that we really are going to try to focus on and do a little bit more of.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. So I'm looking at the time. We have about 5 minutes. So we're going to continue this discussion in the networking session at 3:15 on racial equity and inclusion, and Victoria and Jacqueline will be able to join us in that conversation. And if Joy is able to, she'll be back to join us at that time. But before we go, what I want to do is allow for each of you, Jacqueline, Evette, and Victoria, to just briefly, for any organization that's about to undertake this DEI effort or initiative within their organization, what would be some quick advice that you would give them?
I'll start, I guess. The advice, I guess, is always listening. Make a point of that being a priority for your organization. We're going to be going through training and when somebody's onboarded, that's a priority for hiring. Also creating career paths. So, you want to show in real time, like everybody said, in actions, what your intention is to change, not just talk. And I think that's what we've heard loud and clear through all these listening sessions too, is that people really want, why aren't there more people here there? Why do I not see other people like me here? And how they feel about it. And, you know, it causes turnover and all these other things that are not good for any organization. And also in leadership, like, why is it the way it is and how can we undo it? So just really facing those things and listening, having safe places for all people to talk about their experience and how they're feeling, and how, you know, that's when you weed out who wants to change and who's willing to do that work, because it is not easy, but it is very valuable and something we all need to do. So
Thank you, Jacqueline.
Yeah.
Quickly, 1 minute, Evette, what would you advise organizations to do?
Yeah, no, I would just echo a lot of what Jacqueline was saying. And I think for us, it's like, how do we kind of balance that tension between the sense of urgency and the reality of how complex, you know, this system, everything we've inherited did not happen overnight. It's been hundreds of years. I would say, we could even say thousands, just in our human development. Yeah, just kind of be, be patient with yourselves. And for us, like, we know it feels so big. And so we try to really focus on what gives us light, like what we lead with our hearts. So we figure out like what is really meaningful for us and what will keep us in the work, because it is going to get hard and it gets lonely. So yeah, just really focus in on like what brings you light, and do that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Victoria?
So, and I would just say, some of the same things, get in touch with your own unconscious bias, really begin to learn, what your communication and your leadership styles and behaviors are, learn the culture of your organization, because all organizations and institutions need to do them differently. Sometimes we like to compare ourselves to others, but get in touch with what is needed in your organization. Ask questions, listen deeply, and choose the starting point. Sometimes this can be so overwhelming, you don't really know where to start, but choose a starting point. Wherever you start is the best place for you to start. Really talk about resources. You really need to plan for resources, because you're going to need resources. Strive to develop a team. This is something that can't be done by just one person in the organization. That was the first thing I learned when I went to get some formal training up at Cornell University. They said, you have to have a team. This has to be done in a collective mode, because if you're the only one pushing for this in your organization, it's not going to really be successful. So those are just some basic things to think about as you start.
We have 1 minute and it's going to cut us off. So Joy, people can contact you through the HOVA app to ask you any questions. So thank all of you for joining us, and we'll see you, and you can also connect with me through the HOVA app. Thank you so much, ladies, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.